Hello, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to At the Table, the official podcast of the Collectivist, where we invite change makers and community leaders to join us at the table to share stories, ideas, and experiences. I'm your host, Maui. Today, while we set the table before our dinner guests get here, I'd like to talk about local government. Local government may not always make the big splashy national headlines. You won't read about it in your New York Times and your um, Boston Globe and your LA Times. But it has a profound impact on our day to day lives, from uh, town hall to the city council. Our elected officials and their policies shape the very fabric of our communities. Local government is where we can make our voices heard and affect change where it matters most. The roads we drive on, the schools our children attend, the safety and security of our neighborhoods. Local government plays a vital role in shaping the communities that we call home. And yet, how many of us really pay attention to who is running for office or what their positions are on the issues that matter to us? That's why voters' guides are so important. They help us become informed about the candidates, their platforms, their records, so that we can make informed decisions at the ballot box. But but being informed isn't just about voting. It's also about understanding the issues and staying engaged in the political process beyond election day. When we're taking an active role in shaping our local government, we can truly make a difference. We uh, we can help create a community that reflects our values and provides the opportunities and resources that our families need to thrive. With that in mind, I have some great people joining me at the table today. Tonight, I'm talking to some of the contributors to the Activist Toolkit. It's a local voters guide that is distributed to the West Cook region. So let's get started. This week, joining me at the table, I have Betty Alzamora. Betty Alzamora is a senior program manager and writer based out of Forest Park, Illinois, originally from Caracas, Venezuela, and raised in Montreal, Canada. Betty moved to Chicago in 2004, made her home in Forest Park in 2007. Um, I know Betty through her amazing social justice and human rights work. She's very passionate about volunteer advocacy, um, from immigration justice to LGBTQ plus rights to democracy initiatives. Uh, she also helped manage the political campaign for Forest Park Forward, worked on the Let Forest Park Vote campaign to bring a referendum to the ballot. She's a lead safety marshal with Indivisible Chicago. She helps organize rallies and marches all over the city. She's also with me, one of the co-founders of Forest Park Against Racism. Currently on the board of directors for Indivisible Chicago and APOLGA, which is the Oak Park Area Lesbian and Gay Association. Betty, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Good evening. It's
Good
great to
evening.
see you.
It's great to see you too. Next up, we have Carolina Song. Carolina has lived in and been civically engaged in the Oak Park area for more than 25 years. She's born in Chicago, has lived her entire life here, although her parents immigrated from Korea. So she's a first or second generation American. I don't know. I'm reading her bio right now. I'm not sure. I think that would mean that you are first generation American. Um, she's always had an interest in civic engagement, plus a wonky fascination with the details of policy and governance. Um, Her volunteer work first started with the Howard Brown Memorial Clinic as an intake worker, but she's done many other things. You know, not the least of which she's gotten married, started a family, been active in the PTO as well, and is just an all around wonderful human being. Carolina, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being on. And last but not least, he needs no introduction because you all know him. He is the preeminent journalist in the West Cook region. It's Michael Romaine, everybody. Michael Romaine. Michael's joining us audio tonight. Michael, how are you?
Hi, Maui. You're too kind.
I try. I try.
Make me sound like a celebrity or something.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of are around here, and you know the journalism work that you do. It cannot be understated what a treasure you are to our community, and so it's a pleasure to have you on today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's kind of get into it. Let's get into the appetizer course. Um, I just want to know a little bit, if you can tell me, Carolina, how did the Activist Toolkit come to be?
So it started several years ago, like a lot of things, with the dismay from the Trump regime. And it originally began as an effort by Paul Goyette and myself to just keep track of all of the protests and ways to make one's voice heard and just put that out there. It became clear though after a while that was logistically very difficult to do, to keep track of all of those things that had different organizing groups, different lead times, so on and so forth. And we also were both very aware of the things that you said about the critical importance of local government. And so, although we couldn't really keep a timely calendar of protests, what we could do was serve as a repository of information so that folks could take that and become more involved, more engaged, to the level that they so choose. And it kind of, um, honestly, Paul and I just thought we were just indulging our wonky selves. And then suddenly it became more of a thing. And I'm really gratified and pleased that it's been of interest and of use to people and that it's expanded into some of the surrounding communities with awesome
Absolutely.
people like Michael Romaine and Betty taking the lead in their communities.
Yeah, and so obviously, right, you and Paul started in the Oak Park area. Betty, you like me are Forest Parker. Uh, how did you get involved in the voters guide in the
I
toolkit?
I I basically do anything that Carolina and Paul tell me. No, that's not true, but yes, that's true too. As a Venezuelan national, as somebody who was deeply involved in a lot of the protest actions that were going on at the turn of the century, I can't believe I'm saying that. One of the things that I learned, one of the key takeaways was that it takes an informed electorate to be able to make informed decisions at the ballot box. And unless we open up as many pathways to that information through, investigative journalism, through factual reporting, and through citizen advocacy and journalism as well. For me, the toolkit spoke to a lot of that. It's a fact-based, neutral, um, collective gathering of informed questions that are disseminated to candidates for their considered responses. And to me that's just valuable, right? That's just
Yeah,
that one-on-one thing that happens with a candidate and the electorate. Super important.
absolutely. And if you, I'm very curious about this in terms of creating this. How do you build trust with the community to believe what you're saying, right? Because especially in this day and age, right, the age of misinformation,
Yep.
you can find basically anything reinforcing your core beliefs, right?
Yeah.
So I'd be very curious as to how do you build that trust with the community?
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to default into confirmation bias, right, Maui? I think
Yeah,
that's at the heart of your question. And to me, it's the consistency of the work that has gone into the Activist Toolkit that, Carolina and Paul have put into it. The fact that it's come out consistently since 2017 in all of our municipal elections. And you take it to engaged members of community to ask them to contribute because they have a voice from within the community. So what I'm saying, it's not insular. It's not just, a handful of people that have been handpicked. It goes beyond. You get more engagement from people who also have the ear of other community members and therefore can actually instill and build trust because they have contributed. So it's transparent in that sense. It's not something that's done in isolation and as part of a think tank. There are people from each community that are actively involved in coming up with the questions and then doing the round of editing to find the relevance for their specific communities. That's important. That's part of how you build trust.
Yeah. Mike, I'd love to know from you how you're involved in the toolkit. Are you involved in the question creation as well? Or are you more involved in the dissemination of it, being a journalist yourself? How do you how do you interface with this?
Well, I began actively helping out in the development of the toolkit alongside Paul last year. I think that was my first time taking an active role in helping flesh out the toolkit for Proviso, mainly suburbs of Maywood, Elwood, and Broadview, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
So what Paul does is he typically calls me up, schedules a day for us to to Zoom, and I basically start talking, and he takes notes. He'll ask me about issues and topics in each race that I know about, and he takes that information that I feed him, and he formulates questions for candidates. And last year, that was the extent of my involvement. This year, I'll do much more to actively disseminate the toolkit, mainly through a website of my own that I'm creating called provisovotes2023.com that will essentially give a rundown of every municipal, library, school board, and park district race in the 9 suburbs that Village Free Press, the newspaper I started in 2013, covers, so that people can go to this site and get a sense of all of the races. And on that site, there's a link at the top of on the home page. There's a tab for people to access the Activist Toolkit so that they can get that more in-depth election information on Maywood. I believe that's the only town that's going to be covered in the toolkit because it's the only suburb from the ones that were covered last year that has a competitive trustee race. So
Yeah.
they'll be able to go click on the Activist Toolkit, and if they're at least interested in Maywood and other races that are covered in the comprehensive way and the exhaustive way that Paul and Carolina cover these races, if they want to drill down on that site, they can do so. So I hope to drive traffic to the Activist Toolkit that way, and also obviously we'll be actively talking it up out in the community when I do various candidate forums and things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to know a bit about like the segments of the toolkit, right? So is it comprehensive questions based on identified issues that community members want to know their positions on? Is it does it comprise of any key voting history if they have a pre-existing service done to a community. Anything like that. I'm just curious as to what the components are for questioning and presenting the candidates to the people.
So putting this together is always a balancing act. I want to stress that unlike some of the other things that I've been involved with in my life, like, for example, marshaling protests with Betty for Indivisible, marshaling a protest is different from being a participant in a protest, because I've done both of those things. And the toolkit, the voter's guide, is different. It's nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates. I think that's really important to stress. We do want to balance a certain consistency over time with areas of, that we know tend to be always of interest to the community. I think it's important to get insight into a person's decision-making process, how they approach budgeting, for example, but also combine that with a deep dive into what is going on in a community in a given election cycle. And so it's critically important to have, when you're thinking about it, you're hopefully thinking about it from outside just your own specific demographic. So you want to think about, people, you want to think about renters. If you're a homeowner, you want to think about renters. I think that's a huge blind spot for people in our community who are homeowners, is to completely ignore the fact that there's a substantial renting community in
As
all.
a renter myself, thank you.
So, and we don't spend enough time thinking about that. We don't spend enough time on policy with that. It's really important to think about the disabled, the elderly, families with children, all these people that, that may have their lives impacted by what local government is and isn't thinking about. So, and we do want to be both timeless and have some continuity over the course of guides, so that, because it makes it easier then to compare. When you have incumbent candidates, then you have the ability to take a look at what they've said in the past versus what they're saying this time around. And, we try to pull in all the media, links to all the media about them, so that it's a ton of information, but it's a way to see, well, how does what they said they would do compare to what they actually wound up doing? And it's really important to have involved, informed community members really writing and editing each community's thing, which is why, for example, we haven't been able to do some other communities that are equally interesting. We haven't, for example, we've tried it with Berwyn, but that's still, that's not going to happen in this cycle. And Cicero, we haven't been able to do that. So, and then there's the other thing that we're trying to balance, is providing a lot of information, but not so much information that it overwhelms people, so that they don't have a reaction of, okay, I don't want to read this. This is too much information. Just tell me who to vote for.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we are also thinking about candidates, because I'll be honest, we have gotten feedback from candidates who say this is too damn long. So we want to ask a lot of questions. We know we can't ask all of them. And so it's just trying to pull out what we need to keep, what we have to reluctantly push aside for the things that are bubbling up in a given election cycle.
Yeah. Betty, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think Carolina's covered a ton. Yeah, it's how do you find that balance, right? Like, I think, when we think about future iterations of the Activist Toolkit, how do you make it more interactive? How do you provide more in-depth background research about individuals that are contesting in electorate races? But how do you do it in a way that still remains something that people want to consume? I know that, certainly in this last, in this first stage of the mayoral race in Chicago, I've done a tremendous amount of research on some of the candidates that have been that I'd never actually had gone through that process before, and came to find that that was so deeply important in this race in particular to understand the background of some of the folks that are competing. And I wish we could do some more of that in our community races, like to learn more about the individuals and their trajectory and what's led them to become candidates. Those are things that I'd love to be able to focus in the future.
Yeah, that actually is a great lead in from our appetizers to our main course here. But first question for the main course is, so now that we understand what it is and what you're doing, do you see ways that the guide can expand, and improve? Like, do you have like a wish list of things that you would like to see be able to be included in it, if you have the, you know, the capacity, and the, community resources to do so?
I can tell you that I think one of the things that would be incredible is being able to leverage platforms like this
Hmm.
to have more one-on-one interviews with the candidates. So the use of video becomes far more prevalent. We see it happening all the time in places like YouTube and TikTok.
Hmm.
These are media sources and channels that could potentially be folded in, but to Carolina's point, it's a question of capacity and bandwidth.
Yeah,
Still, there's community members that would really totally dig that. And it appeals to a different demographic too. Maybe younger voters might find that more appealing than doing the reading that would be required. So some, food for thought for the future.
absolutely. And I think video, you kind of get to, to use the parlance of youth, you get the vibe check a little bit
Mhm,
more, right?
mhm.
uh you can read and kind of and understand people's positions, but, you know video, be able to see them, hear them, actually look in their eyes,
For sure.
hear their sincerity or lack thereof. um
I
that is
completely
important. There are some, those are the intangibles that you can't get by just looking at a piece of paper.
completely agree, and I'd love to see that. I'd love to see more folks jump on who have that particular skill set, because I'm old, so my bias is toward print. That's how I grew up getting information, and it's one of the ways. It's easy for me, but I understand that's changed. My kids don't consume information in the way that I do. And so that is absolutely something we'd love to do going forward. If we can figure out, you know, um, people who can jump on board and provide that, you have to think about technical issues, what the bandwidth for recording and storing all of that looks like. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see, you know, um, going back to some of these other communities that also have really important issues that, we haven't had. We have to, this doesn't really succeed unless you have buy-in from the community. So there isn't really, from the Canada's perspective, this is just yet one more onerous obligation, and they aren't going to be interested unless they know that there's community buy-in and there's community engagement and involvement. I'd love to see that going forward. One of the things that we did last time was start to take a look at some interesting background data, like demographic data, so you can do some really interesting comparisons between communities. The things like socioeconomic data, income, and that turns out to have a really substantial impact on things, on policy issues like taxes, that you think maybe just exist in a vacuum. Well, none of that exists in a vacuum. So we'd love to do more of that too going forward, and give people the opportunity to go as deep as they do or don't want to go.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well. And I'd love to talk for a minute about, I'm going to circle back to the relationship between the Activist Toolkit and the people that are reading it, and how you build that trust. As you were
Hmm.
talking, I was thinking about, right, the data that you're talking about and whatnot. But once again, what I keep going back to is that in this time of misinformation, where people can, and right, in numbers, and data can always be kind of manipulated to say what you kind of want to say. You can find an angle, a metric to support your position, and because community members, right, individual people, we work. We have families to take care of. We don't have the time to do these deep dives. Most of the things that we accept, I feel like, as fact, are actually things we're accepting on faith in our trust institutions to tell us, up is up and down is down. And we're in an unprecedented time of the creation of things that like look like a duck and sound like a duck but aren't a duck. You know what I mean? So take, on the macro scale, on the national scale, talking about journalism, let's talk about Fox News, right? It has all the affectations of a trusted journalistic institution, but it is a partisan tool to get people to vote one way for one party. How do you, right, because like we obviously come to the table with our own biases, with our own beliefs. How do you uh keep that out of it in a way that people can look at you and say, this is a trusted institution, this isn't a tool of the left or a tool of the right to get me to vote their way? Because at this point, I think a lot of people are just looking for something to kind of reinforce what they already believe. Especially people, by the time you get into our age, right? Like, you're pretty locked in and set in your ways and your beliefs. How do you get people to look at it as like, oh, this is actually unbiased. This is actually giving me a fair and balanced account of things, to borrow Fox News's
To borrow Fox News, indeed.
alleged mission statement. So, how do you do that? I know that's pretty heady and hard to kind of tackle in a succinct answer, but I'd love just at least like your thoughts and meditations, Mike, as a journalist. Maybe let's start with you.
Well, yeah, that's you opened up a philosophical can of worms there, because I'm gonna try to do that without rambling, because that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And I think about it. I've been thinking about it quite often, actually. I've been thinking about it for the last few years. With well, actually, the last several years, as more and more institutions lose that credibility, and more people lose trust in vital institutions that literally make the world go round, and that we depend on for 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 a lot of stuff. I wrote about this a while ago in a column on Barack Obama's latest biography, when he released his autobiography. I think it was last year. And I've been I'm not a huge fan of his liberalism, or that kind of liberalism. But I think in a column I had wrote that I kind of understood Obama's politics, and I understood, which I thought was naive, and I still kind of think it's naive, but I understood his faith in institutions, and why you want to have faith in institutions like American democracy, for instance, however flawed and riddled they are, or why you might want to have faith in the Democratic Party, for instance, to actually rise to the problems that we're having and try to offer some viable solutions to them. You want to have faith in institutions like the press, because what other institution do we have in our modern society that is tasked with interrogating the powers that be and holding them accountable? There's nothing to replace a newspaper and what a newspaper provides. There's nothing to replace the power of a robust, independent media in this country. And we won't be able to do it through blogs. We're not going to do it through Facebook. And I mean, we still have not found how to what institutions we can lean on to do what a newspaper has always done. So we need to have faith in these institutions, but the institutions are broken.
Mhm.
And the media is broken. And part of the reason that an apparatus like a Fox News can become so powerful is because you have such a vacuum created, a vacuum of integrity and a vacuum of real honesty that was created by the mainstream news, probably from the get-go. Because like I said, I've recently been interrogating this whole idea of objectivity in journalism, for instance, which has always been a myth.
Absolutely.
It's always been a myth, and yet we built a whole industry on it. And so, I mean, we built a whole, investigative reporting arose out of Watergate, or at least the popularity of investigating. What we, as journalists, especially as people who have been trained in journalism schools, I haven't, thank God, but people who went through journalism schools, what they consider, the ideal professional journalist is Bob Woodward, and Watergate and that kind of thing. It's being objective, is holding the powerful accountable. But I think back to something that Noam Chomsky once said. He said Watergate was not even that scandalous compared to the scandals that actually happened out of the Nixon White House. So, like, even what we consider to be, the case study of holding the powerful accountable and what journalism is supposed to be, that was an instance of one elite power structure that had an issue with another. It was the Democratic Party that had an issue with the Republican Party, and it was it was about a break-in. But there were so many, and this is in the late 60s or early 70s, whatever, 60s and 70s. This is when Fred Hampton is getting assassinated, for instance, and
Mhm.
you have newspapers like the Tribune who are sending out journalists to essentially parrot the official line, which was a lie that was propagated by local, state, and federal law enforcement officials. So at the same time as you have, we want to think that this edifice that we've created, which is this apparatus of media, this conventional media edifice that we've erected, is something that it is not. It has served a purpose. There are elements of it that are vital and that we need, but there's a lot of it that was built on the perpetuation of lies like objectivity, like you're actually, making systemic change. When, since its inception, mainstream journalism has always been dominated by corporate entities. It's always it's always been controlled by people with the most money. It's always been controlled by the wealthiest in society. Um, and it's never really been objective. It has always been whitewashed.
Yeah.
And,
You know,
you know,
and that's why the toolkit is so interesting to me, because it's at a community level. It's individual people. It's not
exactly,
corporate interests. It's not,
exactly,
you know,
exactly.
it's not people that are so vested and tied to the system that just,
Right.
you know, they can't help but be biased. You mentioned the Fred Hampton thing. I was literally just looking at old articles about that, and the way that the articles kind of just support um,
The official narrative.
the official narrative
Yeah.
from the police, right? It's, you know, everything is, it was a shootout,
Yeah.
Right.
you
Exactly.
know. So
Yeah.
But you know, to your point, and I'll just follow up to tie it into the importance of the activist toolkit. Uh, one of the people who penetrated the official narrative and actually got to know Fred Hampton back during the day was a Pioneer Press newspaper reporter, um, who since deceased. I can't think of his name right now. There are a few local reporters who actually got to know Fred Hampton before he was assassinated. And there's this really great article, Paul Sasson, the late Paul Sasson, who used to write for the Maywood Herald, actually. Um, uh, he recalled in a series of articles covering Fred Hampton at various meetings, and he was at one of the last meetings that Fred last speeches that Fred gave before he was assassinated.
mhm.
And Paul said, in one article, he says, I had this opinion about this guy that was perpetrated on him being this big, tough thug, that a lot of people, and a lot of people, the white people still think that. But he said, this young man was articulate. He really believed in what in what he said, and he was ahead of his time. Um, and this is a local reporter who was saying it because he actually got to know him. He got to know Fred, and it changed his life, and it changed his perception of him. So I think that also speaks to the power of local journalism, and everyday people who are not acting or not even trying to be professional journalists. They're just trying to be decent people, and trying to
Yeah.
do something good in the community, and that's what the activist toolkit is. When you like you know you get rid of all the all of the burden and the mythology around some of these notions that we build up, like professional journalism. Like, yeah, nobody's trying to be Bob Woodward here. We're just trying to, people like Paul in Carolina, they are just trying to do something good for the community they live in. And it shows, and the sincerity comes through because of that intention. And it makes such a difference. I think if they were coming in and if they were doing this on behalf of the New York Times or the Washington Post, people would not respond to it in the same way.
Yeah. I think Michael has probably hit on so many things that I just so deeply resonate with me, Maui.
Yeah.
You know, you ask about how you build trust. You build trust through relationships, through the deep relationships that we have, the conversations that we have, the storytelling. Like this forum that you've created, this dinner table that you've created for us tonight, that you get to share with other people as well. And I think, you know, that's the beauty of something like the Activist Toolkit. It's a it's a neutral tool in the sense that it's not endorsing candidates. It's just bringing the viewpoints of the candidates to the table, so to speak, based on questions that are coming from community. Now, they may not reflect all of the questions the community has, but does that inspire and instill trust? Yes, because there is no corporate agenda. There is no, you know, we're doing this for profit. There is no ulterior motive other than to disseminate, you know, fact-based responses to questions that have engendered from community itself. I think that's powerful.
Yeah.
That's incredibly powerful.
Uh, Absolutely. And I think it's important um, for communities to support initiatives like these, because even though you're not doing this for profit, right? Money is the fuel with which we use to live, right? Like we need money to live. That's the system we've set up, that is capitalism, right? We need money to live, to feed our families and whatnot. Um, it's really important, I think, for communities to be able to support services like this. I was just thinking as Michael was talking, as you were following up there, Betty. Uh, I started on the macro level, right? Now, when we talk about like larger entities of government, federal government, right? And those are the ones that get the most airtime and whatnot, and most bandwidth given to them with these larger journalistic institutions and whatnot. But we don't see that change in a very tangible way for us, right? So we talk about the importance of local government and how you can see much quicker the impact that it has because we're closer to it. What's one level zeroed in from, even from local government? That's grassroots activism. That's grassroots journalism, right? So,
Mhm.
maybe even like, stepping away from the term of local journalism, right, which still is in this institution based mindset, down to community grassroots information
Mhm.
dissemination. The less vested you are from these systems, I think the bigger the chances you're going to get real information.
For sure. This is, not to, you know, dis- divert from the main purpose of the Activist Toolkit. I can tell you that personally, I've taken a more kind of nuanced and discerning approach to the types of news that I consume
Mm,
and the sources from which I will consume. So I have gravitated to independent journalism as opposed to some of the corporate. I've gravitated towards nonprofit. Without going into all the details, it's one of the things that concerns me in our communities that we have to. I find myself more gravitated to the efforts of things like the Activist Toolkit. Michael, I know is got his newsletter
mhm,
that I support. I've supported Paul Goyette's photography because I think it's on me as a community member to be discerning about the news sources that I use, and then to actually actively be able to support them, whether it's through a nonprofit model or through some form of subscription model. It's important to be able to grow. To your point, Maui, it's this grassroots, proximity that corporate journalism is no longer as close to, I guess.
mhm,
I have a love-hate relationship, for instance, with the New York Times. We won't get into that today, but it's, I'm moving away. I'm gravitating more and more to something akin to, for instance, what the Chicago Sun-Times has. It's more of a nonprofit, board managed, community-led enterprise.
mhm,
Anyway, so yeah, it's how do you make it trustworthy? I think it does come down to a lot of what Michael has described. These journalists that embedded themselves with getting to know the individuals that made the news, and take somebody like a Fred Hampton from being, perceived as this, ominous figure in history to somebody that was real and human and a loss to all of us for generations to come.
mhm,
I know that I wander down from time to time to the pool area down in Maywood, and I commune with Fred Hampton at the bust. I've taken photographs of them, but I go there because I find the inspiration and the comfort sometimes in moments that are low. And I think that that has come because of the journalistic work, the historic archival work that so many people have done to actually lift the man as a human, as opposed to something else that other sources, like what you're describing, articles that came from mainstream media that demonized him, would have soon had somebody like me remember him as being something that he was not.
mhm,
He's a wonderful example in our community of what happens when you build the trust and the deep relationships to get to know somebody and to get to know the person behind the current affairs and the history and the meaning making of the moment.
Yeah, I think these are really important things to think about. We've touched on a lot of different things, but I think all of these things are very important to think about in relationship to your local government. Um, where you're getting the information on them, how you're learning about who they are as a person, right? Like all of these things tie into each other. All of these things are interconnected. That was a very good dinner. I want to move on to some dessert though. I would love to know if y'all could talk a little bit about like the current landscape of local politics this year, the races we should be paying close attention to. Are there any that are kind of jumping out at you? Let's start with you, Carolina. I'd love to know, like, are there any races in particular you're like, pay attention to this one?
Well, I'm going to talk about something in specific, but I also want to say in general, sometimes I think that people think of local politics as, oh, this sort of something that is separate from the polarized national politics. And I say, you know what? Not so fast. We need to be aware of the fact that that our local politics affects our local lives in a lot of ways that we don't think about. One example in Oak Park is, the composition of the village trustee board determined how the vote on whether or not to install the flock police cameras, how that went down.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one example. And we also need to be aware that there are national entities like elements on the far right, for example, are openly going in and investing in things like local school board races, because they're trying to nationalize them because number one, it seems benign. We have this idea that because local politics have traditionally been nonpartisan, that, oh, it's not like dirty or mean the way politics are, that it's benign. It's a stealth effort to get in. So there are nationalized groups putting a lot of money into local races. And so that is something we need to be aware of and watchful for. Groups like Awake Illinois, for example, that have come out and said that they are funding training and funding candidates for things like library and school board races. And speaking of school board races, I actually think that this time around, one of the races that we need to look at is the Proviso school board race, District 209, because that high school has a lot of controversy, a lot of really serious issues, and a lot of concerns about whether or not these kids are going to get the education that they need. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to that. I mean, even if you don't have kids, the quality of your high school, or the perceived quality of the high school, tends to play a role in whether or not people want to invest in your community, want to move there, want to live there in the long term, want to buy property there. And so we really need to look at all of this stuff. And Betty can provide more specifics about that race, but that is something that I've been looking at and going, wow, we really need to pay attention to this, regardless of whether or not we have kids, regardless of whether or not we actually live in that particular school district.
Yeah. I real quick plug for another episode of this show. We pre-record this, so at the time of me saying this, it has not been recorded, but it's being recorded in a few days. So be sure to be on the lookout for our coverage on what's happening in Proviso. The episode will be called Unpacking Proviso.
Great.
I will also be releasing a series of one-on-one interviews, one with Carissa Gillespie, a teacher at Proviso West, and a community member. Has lived in Westchester, grew up in Maywood, as well as Claudia Medina, who is currently running for the school board, and Rodney Alexander, another current school board member. So those one-on-ones especially, pay very close attention to. they're very, very interesting.
It's amazing to hear that, Maui, and I couldn't tell you how thrilled I am to hear. I would echo what Carolina has just said. I
Mhm.
believe the 209 race, the D209 Proviso Township School Board race, to be not to say that everything else is unimportant, but this is the one that I'm paying the closest attention to. That it and part of the reason that I'm delighted to hear that you'll be doing this unpacking is that one of the things that really kind of stunned me was that we didn't have any candidate forums out there
Mhm.
for Proviso Township D209 candidates. I believe there was one that was held in Maywood recently. So, I'm glad and very happy to have been able to reach out to the League of Women Voters and in partnership with Forest Park Public Library, we'll be hosting a candidate forum online in a week's time on March 13th. Because it was so deeply important to me that people again get to hear from the candidates on a one-on-one basis. But
Yeah.
to your point, and this is, I think, what I was alluding to earlier, these interviews, these one-on-one interviews with some of the people that have um, been so integral to the stories that
Mhm.
are being told with like and to be able to hear it from different sides of the equation. So Mr. Alexander, Miss Medina, Miss Gillespie, I mean, they're going to come in with different perspectives, but they're telling a story around something that's been going on not just for the last 3 years. I would argue it's really been for the last 3 decades at the
Yes,
Proviso
that's
Township.
what my research has kind of uncovered.
And so there's so much volatility, but I also want to bring it up, Maui, to something else that Carolina said as
Mm.
well, which I couldn't agree with more, which is we as a community need to start paying closer and deeper attention to school board races, to public libraries board races. There are extremist forces out there like Awake that are making those concerted efforts. Now, Awake Illinois is, and it does have a slate of candidates that they have trained that they are helping along the way. They haven't published who those people are.
Mm.
Now, we know because I've participated in several protests, I've been keeping a lot of watchful vigilance in in a lot of what they're doing. We know that it's happening. They're actually saying, well, we'll publish the list as we get closer to the municipal elections themselves.
Mhm.
People are already voting,
Yeah.
and they're already out there influencing the vote by having done all the training and providing some of the funding and the like. Awake Illinois is not that far away from us. Lyons Township has a school board election, and it is said that 3 of the candidates are supported by Awake Illinois. Now, whether true or not, it'll remain to be seen once the official Awake Illinois endorsed candidate list comes out. What we do know is those 3 candidates have been cited at trainings. They've been cited at Awake Illinois events. Um, and their social media postings speak to some of the same rhetoric that Awake Illinois uses.
Can you speak to what some of that rhetoric is, like the positions of
It's
Awake Illinois?
so some of well, in a nutshell, it's very transphobic,
Mhm.
homophobic, and racist in nature. And it's couched within this umbrella of, but we're really doing it for the families. We're doing it for the kids. We want to protect the kids. But this is the same organization that also labeled our governor, Governor Pritzker, as a groomer of young kids for the gays to go and get. So they use very extreme language in their social media postings. And they have traction. They have gained traction. They have gained an audience. And certainly, there are conservative forces from within the confines of the city of Chicago that are espousing and embracing the same language.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into that. I know that's a completely different conversation, but
Yeah,
we
we'll have
can.
to have you back and
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
dive
that
deeper
is,
into that.
you unpack Awake Illinois' influence across, I mean, Lyons Township, LaGrange is not that far from us. It's happening near us. And so when it's not to say that that's what's going to happen at D209, but if we have to pay attention, and this is, again, bringing it back to Activist to the Activist Toolkit, why it matters, why it's so important that we keep people focused and engaged, is because things happen in darkness when we're not paying attention, because we become complacent and we forget that there are insidious forces that have been organizing again for decades for this moment.
Yeah.
And so let's not let it happen.
And to build on that, to bring it back to this whole philosophical discussion about our institutions and the amount of trust they do and don't deserve. I mean, because this is something that I think about a lot, like how you make change. Is it from within or without? Are you trying to work? Is it, what kinds of change can you do from within our institutions versus something like direct action? And I don't have the answers. It's something that I think about, though. And all I can say is still, I mean, I hate to invoke that cliche about how if you're not at the table, you're getting served, but our institutions are imperfect, because humans are imperfect. They need scrutiny, skeptical scrutiny, but at the same time, the powerful forces, the money powerful forces are not walking away from our institutions. And so if we aren't engaging with them with the appropriate level of, scrutiny and skepticism, yes, but if we take that distrust and we walk away from them, I'm afraid that makes us even more vulnerable to, extremists and corporate powers, because they are not walking away from those institutions.
Yeah. Michael, I see you're unmuted there. I'd love to hear what you have to add to this.
Well, I thought Carolina brought up a really excellent point where you're talking, Maui, about getting people to realize the impact of local governance on their lives, and the responsibility that that a local press has toward helping people realize the impact. What I've been thinking about recently, though, is just how and this doesn't just apply to this, applies to the local in general, where you're talking about local journalism or local politics. I think people forget that the local is entwined in the international and vice versa, to Carolina's point. And we have to start looking at these issues of scale. In this globalized age, scale is kind of diminished. So things are so they've always been interrelated and interconnected, but they're more interrelated and interconnected than ever before. And local newspapers traditionally, especially papers like Wednesday Journal, my former employer, have a really hard time reporting on local issues holistically in a way that allows people to understand that this local issue, Wake, Illinois, for instance, has a national, even international resonance with respect to this global fascist moment that we're in. And it's all over the place, and it resonates even at the local level in the form of groups like these. And we're seeing this all over the place. So one of the African-American newspapers, I did a talk on this a few years ago to prepare for it. I was reading old African-American newspapers and reading some media studies by Black media scholars who were examining the Rodney King riots. And they were, this one guy explained how national media entities like the LA Times reported on the Rodney King case versus local Black-owned press like the LA Sentinel and small local African American owned papers like that. And what they found was the Black papers were able to tell a story, and to deliver that news in a way that that let people know that, one, Rodney King ain't the only Black person who got beat up by the police. This was not a one-off. There are no black and white heroes, because the LA Times, they painted they painted that situation in a very black and white monochromatic way by inventing heroes, the police chief who's, or the local activist who did this. Whereas the Black press, the Black papers, local to the area, were able to tell you, just the other day before Rodney King was beat up, another Black guy was beat up by the police, and he was actually an off-duty police officer. And in fact, this is consistent with the history of anti-Black police violence that goes back decades and decades and decades. And in fact, it's all over the place. It gave you a sort of a historical resonance and historical context that the national press could not give you. Now, fast forward to today, when we're talking about George Floyd, for instance, and how the death of George Floyd directly led to, and I could, this is interesting, George Floyd died, and 2 years later, we have the Safety Act. His death directly led to the Illinois Black Caucus getting mobilized and saying, this is a moment that we want to make sure we capitalize on, and we take advantage of. And Kimberly Lightford, local politicians, a Maywood resident, she said she took it by the horns. She galvanized her colleagues in a way that they hadn't acted before in probably ever. And she was able, along with her colleagues in the Black Caucus, they were able to pass a police reform that would have been unthinkable before George Floyd. And now, pending what happens in the courts, if cash bail ultimately gets resolved, and I hope it will, my cousin goes to jail, or somebody in my family, your neighbor goes to jail, or one of us gets in a situation in a bind, and we don't have to worry about staying in jail because we don't have money. Like, this is how the international and national resonates directly to the local, and vice versa, because that's a person in our community, a lawmaker in our community, who made that happen, and who was motivated because due to this heinous lynching, which is what it was, that happened in Minneapolis and had international resonance. How do we, as a local press, how does anybody doing local journalism tell these stories in a way that's holistic and lets people know that what you're doing? The local has international resonance, and the national dictates the local. Federal funding often trickles down to the local. Where do local police departments in Broadview and Maywood get AK-49s and in military grade vehicles? It's because of international wars that had because we're a militarized society, and we right. fight all the time, and we go through military stuff all the times. Ultimately, the military can't use it, and so they need to get rid of it. And so there was a bill passed, that said, okay, we can give this stuff to local police departments. And now you have your police parade, or your police riding a tank in a damn Christmas parade, and we're like, wave at the tank. So then this is how like really absurd sociopathic norms get normalized. And it's just like, everybody thinks, okay, this is, oh wow, the police got a tank now, or we like none of this stuff happens naturally. None of this stuff comes out of thin air, and oftentimes we don't pay attention to it until the tank shows up in your Christmas parade, and then we're just like, oh, I guess let's decorate the tank.
Yeah, that's a lot, and we could keep going on and on about this, because that's how messy and complicated this all is, and that's why it's so important that you vote in your local elections. Last thing before I let y'all go, and we're running a little bit long here, but that's okay. We have the luxury of being able to do that. My last question to all of you, this segment is what I call the to-go plate. All right, so this is where we provide actionable steps for listeners to get involved and support the guest's work. So just one at a time, each of you, if you have a way for people to get involved and support the work that you're doing, please let our community know how they can best support you. Let's start with Carolina.
Well, we don't currently have a monetary ask. You're making me regret that we don't. What I will say is stay engaged. The way to support this is to stay engaged. The things like the Activist Toolkit voter guide have resonance, have power, have meaning because of community engagement. So if our political candidates know that this is something that people are involved in, look to, then they have an incentive to spend some time answering these questions. I would say, to the extent that your life circumstances permit, try to stay aware, try to stay involved if you can, even voting if you want to participate. A lot of our local governments have volunteer citizen commissions and committees. If that's something you have the bandwidth for, do that. What I would say is, our institutions, interrogate them. Don't take them as gospel, but don't walk away from them. Think about your role in the community and how you can just make your own life better and the lives of other people too. Just engage. Don't take things for granted. Just engage, though.
Engage. I love that. Betty, how about you?
I'll put on my Indivisible Chicago and Opalga hat on right now for a shameless plug. One of the things that I'm working on right now, in partnership with some good people in community from various different faith traditions, but elsewhere as well, is creating an advocacy network. So we hosted a couple of weeks back a planning session with about 22 community members to understand in particular what advocacy means to them in the LGBTQ plus and intersectional spaces. And so we're having a follow-up session on March 20th, for which I'll be glad to invite all of you if you wish to join. Where we're having kind of those conversations about, well, what do we want to do to organize? Here are some of the issues. We talked the last time around about some of the things that are happening in our community and the prevalence of groups like Awake Illinois, and how we can get involved by creating. One of the things that I'd like to do is create a rapid response network for the western suburbs, where we can actually be informed about the presence of these groups as they show up at board meetings. We've had them show up in Riverside, we've had them show up in LaGrange, and that it's good to be able to bring out community members to say that book bannings are not good. Electing officials to the board that represent the views of extremist hate groups like Awake Illinois is not good. So yeah, I think that's some of the work that, it's starting up. There's a lot of traction, a lot of interest, and I would love for you all to be a part of that as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. If you could send me any links that you have,
Will do.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Will do. Thank you so much.
And Mike, how about you? Any actionable steps you got or ways that people can support your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Will be shameless in this plug. I have a Substack newsletter that people can go to continue following my local reporting and commentary. It's michaelromaine.substack.com. And the election guide website for the Proviso suburbs that comprise the Village Free Press target market. Is provisovotes2023.com, and it should be up in a matter of days. And that will also allow people to access the Activist Toolkit as well. And so, yeah, they can go to both of those to those sites to keep up with some of the stuff that I'm doing, and also obviously would urge people to follow the Collectivist once it becomes active as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, by the time this is out, it will be active and multiple episodes up. So absolutely make sure you're following. I want to thank our panel tonight for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure we could have gone another hour. That's how important this stuff is. I'm sure I'll have all of them back on to continue to talk about these issues and maybe dial in the focus on some of the specific things we pointed out in this episode. My hope is that one day we're able to do this from weekly to daily. So, the only way you can do that is to support. I'm going to put you all backstage. Feel free to hang out through my outro, and I'll talk to you once we're done recording.
Hey, Maui, can I jump in with one more specific ask? Just piggybacking on Michael's, incipient website and stuff like that, which I'm so excited to hear about. I think that's great. One specific thing that folks can do is get engaged in your local elections. Tell your local candidates, hey, I read about your responses in the, the voter's guide, and I'd like to know more about X. Or if they're choose not to fill it out, say, hey, how come you didn't fill that out? Because that is what is going to make our local electeds, our local candidates pay attention, is to know that there are people out there looking at this and taking a look at whether or not they participate and what they do or don't do.
And above all, vote. Everybody has to go out there and vote. We cannot continue to be in a world where less than 30% of our voting public is out there voting. So vote, people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I'm going to put you backstage. I'll sign off, and then I'll debrief with you real quick. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So that's a wrap on this week's episode. I hope you had fun at the table and you take a plate of what you learned here today about the importance of and impact of local government. It affects our lives in so many ways. If you were voting in national elections, if you're turning up for the presidential election, but you're not turning up for your local trustee election, your local board of education election, you are doing not only yourself a disservice, but your community a disservice. You heard why tonight from a panel of incredibly engaged, incredibly passionate people. And remember that these people, they don't have moneyed interests in this. They're not profiting from this. They're doing this because they care, not just about themselves, but about their community. Like, we are a communal family as the community of Forest Park, Oak Park, Maywood, Proviso District, right? Like the West Cook region, right? We're, a family within a family within a family within a family. So the more engaged you are on every level, the better, to make change happen. Like they said, don't forget to check out the voter's guide for the next election. Don't forget to vote. Let your voice be heard through your vote. Join us next time. We'll continue to explore more issues with the change makers that make a difference in our communities. Stay informed, get involved, work together to build the kind of community that we all want to call home. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to follow us on Patreon, Facebook, Instagram, or collectivistmedia.org to support radical community journalism. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. It's down here, and click the bell. That's important too, so you get notified every time we have a new episode go up. I look forward to seeing you next week at the table. Echo love.